Wonderful to be with you. I've been looking forward to this, and what a delight. This council, this group of colleges that are represented here has had a big impact on my life. I mean, I'm the president of the American Enterprise Institute, and I'm going to talk to you about bringing America together, and that's the main topic. But I want to start by thanking you for giving me and my family the life that we enjoyed. Most of you are not aware. Some of you I have met in the past, but I will say that my grandfather, C.C. Brooks, was the dean of students at Wheaton College all the way through the 1950s. Later was the dean of students at Westmont College. My father, David Brooks, was a professor of mathematics for 35 years, first at Whitworth, and then later in most of his career at Seattle Pacific. Interestingly, my father, who was a relatively mild-mannered guy, when he was about 40 years old, decided that he wanted to really shake things up and do something crazy. So at a CCCU conference for mathematicians, he met another guy, another professor who had a parallel life to his, who taught at Calvin College in Grand Rapids. And it turned out that they both had 15-year-old sons at the time. I was one of them. And they decided, just on a lark, to trade lives, houses, jobs, everything, not spouses. That would be like Berkeley. That's not, not that. And so, when I was a sophomore in high school, I just took off. We put all our stuff in the car and we moved to Grand Rapids, a place we'd never been before. And we moved into another family's house. And I moved into the kid's room and read his comic books. And I rode his bike and I hung out with his friends and I went to his school. And I did that for a year. I never met the kid. My family never spent any time with that family, but that was the greatest adventure of my dad's, I think, middle-aged life, was something that had entirely to do with this. Why do I bring all this up? Because, all of these punctuating events to the equilibrium of my family's life has had something to do with schools that are represented in this room, and has been so going back generations in my family. Thank you so much for that. Thank you for your mission. Thank you for your work, and thank you for your commitment to truth and beauty and trying to bring America together, and that's what I want to talk with you about today. I'm the president of a think tank here in D.C., a think tank that's been around for 80 years, an academic think tank. This is one that has pure academic freedom. It's just like a college insofar as I don't tell people what to write and we have no corporate policies. And I have to tell you, over the past 10 years as the president of AEI, I've seen a lot of change in the policy environment, and one that I don't like so very much. See major problems in the level of polarization in this country. This comes as no surprise to any of you. We see bitterness and hatred and disrespect in the way that we talk about policy and politics, like I've never seen in my life. Probably you too. And maybe you wonder, what can I do in my job to try to change the culture? Because this is not a political problem. We all know that this is a cultural problem. You are cultural institutions. So what can we do to bear witness to the truth of the master every day and try to bring it all the way up, or some would say all the way down, to Washington, D.C.? I'm going to give you my thoughts on that because I have strong views on this. And by the way, I am going back to academia. I was an academic for a long time. I taught mostly at Syracuse University before I became president of AEI. And I'm going back to academia. This summer, I'm going to a professorship at Harvard. So I'm thinking a lot about how we in higher ed can try to change the culture right here in Washington, D.C. Now, to begin with, one of the things that I want to share with you, this is not news to you, but I want to remind you that when we set knowledge forward, when we try to change something, when we try to switch something, I mean, most of life is not switches, it's dials. But when we want to switch something that's really, really wrong, we have to think about an old problem in a new way. Okay? It's an epiphany, to use our Christian language. So, and by the way, this is not just higher ed, this is not just business, this is not just intellectual life, this is all of life. And we all have epiphanies that change the course of our day-to-day existence. And I'll give you one tiny example, just from my own life, because it's kind of on my mind of late. My wife, Esther, and I, we have 3 kids. 2 have grown up and left the nest. But my middle son, who's now a farmer in Idaho, didn't go to college. 2 years ago, when he was still in high school, we were having a really bad parent-teacher conference. I mean, really, really ugly. It was a grades problem, not living up to his potential. Is he going to graduate? Will he be able to go to college? And this is an old problem. This had been going on since he was a kid, since he was in, fourth or fifth grade, year after year. He's a bright kid, tons of potential, not living up to that potential. Some of you have kids like this. And, the worst parent-teacher conference of our lives. We were very frustrated, a little depressed, in the car on the way home. And my wife, she kind of breaks the ice because we had been silent for a minute. And she said, and she's an optimist, by the way. She's from Barcelona. And she says, I think that we're thinking about this old problem in a new way. I think we need to think about it in a new way. And I said, I'm all ears, because I've had it. She said, at least we know he's not cheating. So that's the spirit in which I want to take on a big crisis in America today. The crisis in America today. It's not a crisis of right versus left, in my view. It's not a crisis of how big the government is, in my view. It's a crisis in the way that we treat each other as brothers and sisters, and how our leaders are encouraging us to not treat each other as brothers and sisters. That, in my view, is an existential crisis for this country, and we, as leaders in the culture, have to do something about it. To start with that, we have to think about this in a new way. Okay, now, being in the sort of the middle of these public debates a lot, running this think tank, I remember when I first saw this as the crisis that I believe it is. This was some years ago when, things were bad and there was a lot of bitterness and people weren't getting along and right versus left and all this stuff. But I saw it as something different than just that. In 2014, this is a couple of years before the 2016 election, when everybody and his brother was going to run for the Republican nomination. Now, I do about 175 speeches a year. There's, when you're the president of a big Washington think tank, there's actually not that much thinking in tanks. It's mostly sitting on planes and talking to people. It's great. I mean, a lot of you do this lifestyle too. It's fantastic. And I do a lot of different, I speak at very left-wing college campuses, and I speak to conservative activist groups and chambers of commerce and everything in between. I love talking to everybody. And it was one of this conservative audiences in 2014 that I was talking to at a big conference of activists in New Hampshire, Manchester, New Hampshire, April of 2014. I was the only non-politician on the docket. Everybody was going to run for president except me. It was amazing. It was probably 20 people that had some plan to run for president or had some aspiration to run for president, except me. I don't have to run for anything. I don't have to get any votes. So I got there a little bit early. I was there, half an hour early, and I was listening to they were going through in 15-minute speeches. And the couple that I got to hear before, they were doing what politicians always do when they want to be president. They're throwing just raw steaks out into the audience and watching people, gobble them up. It was all, you're right. The other side, they're wrong. They're stupid. They're evil. Really, really bad stuff. And I thought to myself, I said a little prayer. Lord, what do you want me to do here? What am I supposed to do here? I know for sure I'm not supposed to fire him up and make him angry. I know for sure that's not why God put me in that situation. But I'm there for a reason, because we're always there for a reason. And I thought about it, prayed about it, and it occurred to me that my job was to make it better. Was to try to say something to make it better. So I made a little plan, and I had a set speech I was going to do. It was about economic policy. I'm an economist, so taxes and that sort of thing. But here was my plan. I stopped in the middle of my speech, and I said, we in this room are talking about economic issues, and we in this room mostly agree, I believe. But I want you to think for a minute about the people who are not in this room and who don't agree with us. They're political liberals. And I want you to remember that they're not stupid and they're not evil. They're our brothers and sisters. They're just Americans who disagree with us on public policy. Now, I knew it wasn't going to be a huge applause line. But here's what happened. This lady in the audience says, I think they're stupid and evil. And look, it was kind of like a joke. It was sort of a raucous crowd. She wasn't trying to repudiate me or insult me. She was just like, I mean, it was just kind of a fired up scene, right? And at that moment, so I didn't take it personally. It didn't offend me. It's actually kind of hard to offend me after many years in Washington. But here's what I thought of, okay? I thought of Seattle. Because I grew up in the most left-wing city in America. My dad, I mean, he was Seattle Pacific, but he was still a college professor in Seattle. My mother was a painter. You know, when I say that I'm this child of academics and artists in Seattle, what do you think my political background is? You know, to say I grew up in a liberal family in Seattle is just totally redundant, because they're all liberal families in Seattle, practically. And when that lady said that, she was insulting my family and my friends and the people I grew up with. And, you know, I just reminded me of something that my dad always taught me when I was a kid. The mark of moral courage is not standing up to the people with whom you disagree. It's standing up to the people with whom you agree on behalf of those with whom you disagree. That's the mark of moral courage. That's super hard, right? Because it doesn't make you friends, and yet it must be done. That's what we're called to do. We're not called to have a bunch of friends. We're called to do what's right. And I thought about it, and I thought, you know, this is a critical moment for this country because we're forgetting a key truth. A key truth that everybody in some way, shape, or form grew up kind of like me. How do I say it? Why do I say that? Question for you now. And I'm not going to ask you to, show your hands very often, just once, maybe once or twice. How many of you in this room love somebody with whom you disagree politically? Let's round it off to 100%, which is really good. That's the country I want to live in. I want to live in a country where you love each other, notwithstanding your political views, and where you're not so siloed that you don't know somebody with whom you disagree politically. That's a pluralistic country. You know, we heard the really eloquent words just before I came on about thinking about people who look different than you. What about loving people who think different than you? That, my friends, is embracing diversity. And we're in the ideas business. So the ultimate diversity is not looking different, it's thinking different. Can you embrace that kind of diversity? Can you create an environment where people create that kind of diversity? No. Where they embrace it and they love it? That's the challenge. That's the new thinking. That's the problem that we have and the problem that we need to solve. Okay, so why has it gotten so bitter? What was that lady doing? She was making a joke. The joke actually wasn't it wasn't the problem that people identify in American politics today. We often hear that everybody's too angry, right? Too much anger. Turn on cable TV, they're angry, yelling at each other all the time, right? Actually, it's not an angry situation. Anger is not a problem. There's a very interesting body of psychological research on the subject of anger. Anger, as some of you may know, is uncorrelated with separation and divorce. Good thing, I'm married to a Spaniard. Lots of anger, lots of arguments, thousands. No chance of separation and divorce, none. That's actually what ruins marriages is not anger, and anger is not what we see today. It's what psychologists call contempt. Contempt is the conviction of the utter worthlessness of another person and the expression thereof. That's contempt. And that's what we see all the time. I have a friend who teaches at the University of Washington. His name is John Gottman. Some of you may have heard of him because he's the world's leading expert on marital reconciliation. He has a marriage laboratory, the Gottman Marriage Laboratory. He runs with his wife, Julie. And he has brought thousands of couples together that were on their way to divorce court. The guy's my hero. Look, anybody who keeps a family together is making America stronger and making my life better, and I love him. That's the family is the fundamental basis of every good society in human history. That is an unambiguous fact. So any guy who does it, who's going to bring the families together, who's going to lead to less divorce, less family dissolution, he's doing a great thing. Okay, so I've known John Gottman, and I've had him on my podcast, and I really admire him. And John Gottman has this thing that he can do when he's counseling a couple, when he brings them in for their interview in his marriage laboratory. He can talk to them for an hour, and during that hour, asking a simple set of questions in a protocol that he uses, he can figure out with 97% accuracy if they will be divorced within 3 years. It's incredible. You want to know, right? Because most of you are married. What is it that they show? What are they doing that predicts divorce? And the answer is eye rolling. Eye roll. The ultimate physical sign of contempt, right? You just said something that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Oh, no. You know, we've all had teenage kids. Most of us have had teenage kids. They roll their eyes so hard they fall backwards in their chairs practically, right? Okay, that's just part of being an adolescent. The problem is if you see it accompanied by sarcastic jokes of dismissiveness, especially of expressions of contempt like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, that will lead you to have a permanent enemy. If you're in the persuasion business like I am, contempt is an inherently self-defeating strategy. More importantly, if you want to have a country where people can disagree and still love each other, you must declare war on contempt. Here's the big idea, my friends. The problem is not anger. The problem is not disagreement. The problem is contempt. We have a contempt epidemic in America today. What else isn't the problem? Side note, I hear all the time that, you know what we need in America is more civility, more tolerance. Those, my friends, for Christians are garbage standards. If I told you that my wife Esther and I are civil to each other, you'd be like, you guys need some counseling. If I said, my employees at AEI, they tolerate me, so we got a bad situation on your hands. No. We need a higher standard in a great country. We need a higher standard inside organizations that try to model a better culture than civility and tolerance. What's that standard? Love. Love for whom? Everybody. Sometimes it's easy, like your friends. Matthew 5:44, love your enemies. Dr. Martin Luther King, he put a point on it. He took it a little bit further. If you love your enemies, you will realize that they weren't your enemies after all. That's the secret. Who holds the way to change the culture? You do. The leaders in the organizations that are fundamentally culture-changing organizations. Let's declare war on contempt, and let's substitute love for that contempt. Trick. How? How do you do it? Because, you know, that's really the hard thing. It's really easy. It's pretty easy to sort of sing Kumbaya. It's something else to talk about how to do it. Okay, so why do we express so much contempt? Why do we do this? Look, you know and I know that we are overrun with this contempt crisis. You hear it all the time. If you don't believe it, turn on talk radio, turn on cable television, left, right, it doesn't matter. Read your favorite columnist at your favorite newspaper. You will hear unmitigated contempt. Social media, your students, a lot of your faculty, you're going to hear it because that's just the culture. Now, to begin with, there is a small group of people that are dining out and getting rich and powerful and famous on the basis of this. I have very interesting new data that show that 93% of Americans hate how divided we've become as a country. They hate it. 93%. Nothing polls at 93%. But 93% of us don't like it. That doesn't mean that 93% of us agree politically, or that we agree on anything for that matter. You want to cut this one off and use this one? Okay. So I'm talking into this one. Got it. 93% of Americans hate how divided we've become as a country. Now, good. That's good news. But I want you to remember that means that 7% of us like how divided we are as a country. Why? Because that's their job. We're being terrorized and manipulated and controlled by the 7%. There's a 7% tyranny in America today. And we got to fight back against that. We got to, as they said in the 60s, we got to stand up to the man a little bit here. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about how we could do that as leaders in a second. But I want to remind you that when I say, why do we have so much contempt? It's because 7% like it. What about the rest of us? Because we do it too. I've found myself rolling my eyes. I've said contemptuous things. I've done it. Maybe you have too. Maybe you're better than me. I hope you are. Why do we do it? And the answer is because it's a habit. It's a tick. It's something that's become involuntary. So first, how do I break my habit, and how do I encourage other people to break their habit of contempt? Because if you want to declare war on contempt, you've got to start by breaking the habit. The best neuroscience of habit formation is very interesting these days because it shows that breaking a habit requires a little bit of knowledge about a part of the brain, a very deep part of the brain, called the nucleus accumbens. There's evidence that the nucleus accumbens predates in its development the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the part of your brain right behind your forehead. That's the part of the brain where it made you decide to do what you do consciously. I'm going to go to that conference in Washington, D.C. I'm going to go to the president's conference. This is what I want to do with my career. This is the kind of people I want to hang out with. That's all your medial prefrontal cortex. The part that makes you pursue rewards involuntarily, that's your nucleus accumbens. And that's where you form habits, unconscious behaviors that are self-reinforcing. Contempt is a habit that passes through the nucleus accumbens. Okay, the best science tells us if you want to break a bad habit, you don't just say, I'm not going to do that anymore. You have to retrain your nucleus accumbens by recognizing the impulse to do something, stopping yourself, and putting something else in its place, putting a new reward in its place. That's how you break a habit. For a big part of my career, when I was 19, I dropped out of college when I was 19. I went on the road as a professional French horn player all the way through my 20s. I went back to college when I was 28 and graduated a month before my 30th birthday. I have a non-traditional path to Harvard University, I can tell you. But all the way through that time that I was making my living as a professional French horn player, you know what my bad habit was? Same bad habit as all musicians. I smoked. I didn't like it. I was ashamed of it. It was dirty. It was expensive. It was bad for my health, and it made my mother feel sad. It had to stop. So what did I do? I had to substitute something else for the smoking. So I took up drinking. No. If you have a habit and you want to stop, don't beat yourself up saying, I got to stop this thing. Figure out what you're going to do instead. That is believe it or not, the cutting edge science in breaking habits. Now, back to the issue at hand. We have a contempt habit in America, and that is an expositional habit. That is an expression habit. So we need to express ourselves in a different way when we feel the impulse to express contempt. We need to cut off at that point and do something else. What do you do when you feel contempt? You're going to feel it in the next 24 hours. You're going to hear something that you think is idiotic, that is wrong-headed, that's mistaken, that's dangerous, and you're going to want to roll your eyes and say, oh, so idiotic. Can you believe it? They always talk that way, right? And it's not just politics, right? Here's the thing I really dislike about myself. Some of you have way more employees than I do. I have about 300 full-time employees as president of AEI. Sometimes I feel that way about the people who work for me. And I'm not proud of that. But you have all these exigencies that you face as the chief executive, and all these things that you're the only one that's looking at the whole elephant. And all the people that are lobbying you, and they're coming to you, and they're, it's like the old fable of the 5 blind men that have their hands on different parts of the elephant. One has his hand on the tail and says it's a snake. And you're getting all of this input from people, and they don't see the whole thing. And it's very easy to dismiss with contempt people that don't have total situational awareness of your business. This is not just about politics. As leaders, it's something that we need to resist in every part of our lives. So what do you do when you feel contempt? You stop. Now, I didn't know what to do at this point, so I asked somebody that I hold in enormously high esteem, somebody that I have worked with for 6.5 years and respect as much as anybody else I know, His Holiness the Dalai Lama. It's the weirdest collaboration you can imagine. The president of a think tank in Washington, D.C., is a co-author and collaborator with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the worldwide proponent of Tibetan Buddhism. I'm not a Buddhist. I'm a Christian like you. But this guy has taught me as much about my Christian faith as anybody else, much about my ethics as much about my heart as anybody else. I work with him about every 6 months. We've written together in the New York Times. We're starting a book together. We've done a lot of conferences. And these days, because he's 83, I go to see him in his home in the Himalayan foothills, a little town in India called Dharamsala. And I was there 2 years ago when I was thinking about this problem for the first time. And I said, Your Holiness, what should I do when I feel contempt? He said, practice warmheartedness. And I thought, you got anything else? Because, man, that sounds kind of weak. Then I thought about it. Not everybody here knows the story of the Dalai Lama. He's the leader of the Tibetan people and has been the leader of the Tibetan people since he was a teenager. When he was selected or identified as the Dalai Lama as a teenager, that was not long thereafter that the Chinese communists rolled through Tibet and pushed him and the Tibetan leadership into exile. The Tibetan people, 6 million people in a country of 1 billion at the time, lived in an enormous landmass that controlled the headwaters of all of the Chinese rivers, resources. Tyranny plus the need for resources means that you disappear the poor. And that's exactly what happened. The Chinese communists, with utter naked aggression, military aggression, rolled through a pacifist population and forced the Dalai Lama and his followers into exile in India, to be gone and forgotten forever. But that's not the end of the story, because over the next 60 years, he became the most respected religious figure in the world. How? With warm-heartedness. He told me that he starts every day praying for the Chinese leaders. Every day. Not that they will give him back his homeland, but they will live happy and full lives. Are you strong enough to do that? Are you strong enough every day to pray for your enemies because they're actually not your enemies? It's a hard thing to do. And that's when I realized that treating contempt, seeing contempt, and meeting contempt with warm-heartedness, when I feel contempt, I answer with warm-heartedness, and when I confront contempt from others, I treat it with warm-heartedness, that's for strong people. When you get contempt and you answer with contempt, that's what a weak person does. That's a person who's stimulated and reacts without any conscious decision-making. That's what they do. But if you want to be strong like the Dalai Lama, answer with warm-heartedness. Now, of course, easier said than done. So I asked him at this point, Your Holiness, how? How do I do it? And he said, remember a time when you accidentally did that, the feeling that you got and what you said, and do it again. Now, this is a very robust psychological technique, is remembering a sensation that you have had in your life and trying to recreate it such that you can recreate the behavior. Very, very common in cognitive behavioral therapy. But this is the Tibetan Buddhist version. He said, go back to your room and think of a time when somebody treated you with contempt and you accidentally answered with warm-heartedness. And I want to tell you what I thought of at that moment when actually I did a little meditation on this, not because I want you to use my story, because I want you to think of yours so you can be empowered to do this as well. In 2006, I was still teaching at Syracuse University before I came to AEI, and I had the world's happiest life. You all remember when you were, before you were administrators and life was sweet? And being a professor is the best life. I was beavering away in relative obscurity. I was writing my papers. I had my graduate students, and they were great. And I would write books that nobody would read because they were boring. But it was fun. And I had a strange experience because, I would write these books that were really technical. I'm an economist. They would have, mathematical appendices and the whole thing. And I wrote this book that I thought nobody would read. It was about charitable giving. It was about who gives and who doesn't. And it was just looking at the math and the statistics on who gives and who doesn't. And by the way, who thinks they give but doesn't. And, it had a little bit of politics in it. Who gives more? Conservatives or liberals? Who gives more? Religious people or secular people? Who gives more? Rich people or poor people? Stuff like that in there. Anyway, I published it and expected the phone to not ring. But it rang. Why? Because a couple of famous people started talking about it, hit the news cycle weirdly in the right way. This happens to professors very occasionally, like lightning strikes. And a standard academic suddenly gets in the news, and then his or her life changes forever. And it did. My life has literally never been the same. I was in the press every day. My book, my mathematical, obscure academic book, started selling hundreds of copies a day. I was on talk radio, and I was on CNN. It was weird. And I started getting email from people I'd never met before by the hundreds. See, when you have a book that's a bestseller, people who don't know you read their book and feel like they know you. And so they talk to you like a friend. Or they feed back like an enemy if they don't like your book, in detail. So 2 weeks after the book comes out, it's in the afternoon, it's a Wednesday or Thursday, I was in my office, and I'm still reading my email at this point. My email is very easy to get, and an email pops up from a guy in Texas. Here's how it starts. Dear Professor Brooks, you are a right-wing fraud. Rough beginning. But I keep reading. I'm game. Good sport. And I notice, first thing, that this email is like 5,000 words long. It's going to take me 20 minutes to read this email. But I keep reading, And I'm about halfway through it, and here's what I realize about this email. This guy is going through every single line and chapter in my book in detail, refuting everything I said. It's unbelievable detail, too. In vitriolic detail, I might add. You know, the columns in table 3.1 are reversed, you moron. Stuff like that. And you know, and I realized at that moment, because sometimes you think about your thinking. It's very human and strange. But I realized as I was reading his email, you know what I was thinking? He read my book. Nobody read my books. I was filled with gratitude. Because, and you know what? I decided, I'm going to tell this guy what's written on my heart. I got nothing to lose. So, it's weird. I don't know. I'm not such a saint, but I wrote back to the guy, dear so-and-so, I just want you to know, I know you hate my book and think I'm a stooge. But that book took me 2 years to write, and you read every word of it. I am truly grateful to you for doing that. Thank you. Send. And then I go back to work, right? The guy's not going to answer. 15 minutes later, his response pops back up. Dear Professor Brooks, next time you're in Dallas, if you want to get some dinner, give me a call. Huh? That's power. What did I do? By accident. I answered his contempt with warmheartedness. I changed my heart and his too. That is sheer, unbridled moral power under my disposal. I didn't even know it. I exercised it by accident. The Dalai Lama called that experience back to me and said, remember that. Do it again. No, don't just do it again. Look for an opportunity. Why? Because that's my secret of happiness. I was happy when that happened. I couldn't believe it. By the way, I did not have dinner with that guy. Because if I'd actually contacted him and gone out to dinner with him, I might be, handcuffed to a pipe in his basement now. And, it's like, who knows, right? That's a little kind of a dark joke. I'm sorry about that. Look, this is not mixed company. So, what did I learn? The secret for me, I also learned the secret for leaders that want to change our culture, that want to model something better, and furthermore, who want to be happier people. You deserve to be a happier person. We all need, all of us, to teach future leaders to be happier people. And this is it. Here's what I'm saying. The culture of contempt, this big threat, I started off by being really, really pessimistic and the whole thing, right? I'm not pessimistic. I'm super optimistic because the culture of contempt is one of the means of our salvation. When you see something bad like this, we need to be cultural, social, and spiritual entrepreneurs by seeing the threat as the biggest opportunity of our lifetime to inflect the culture toward what people actually want. That's in our hands. That's in our own, literally, the hands of us as individuals, because we can change our own lives, model the better behavior, teach the better behavior, build our institutions around the better behavior, and maybe change some chunk of America while doing it. So here's the question that I have for you. How are you going to do that? How are you going to do it? How are you going to create an environment and a culture where we can make this happen? You have to start off by confronting contempt and treating it as an opportunity. Going and finding it. When I'm talking to individuals about this, one of the things that I'll say is, how many people do you know with whom you disagree strongly? Again, right before I came up here, we talked about knowing people, loving people, embracing people who look different than you. Good. Now do the harder thing. People who think differently than you. See, we have a culture where we're getting very good at pretending we love diversity, by finding our brothers and sisters who are actually kind of just like us, but look different than us, right? But the hard kind of diversity is the diversity that happens when we silo ourselves off, when we're not around people who disagree with us politically, when ideologically it is the other all the time. How do you do that? You do that by making sure that you silo your social media feeds, and you only watch certain kinds of news, and you only read certain columnists, and you live in certain places, and you only go to a certain church, right? A lot of people by the way, only go to a college because it has the right ideological ecosystem. That's a thing. Isn't it unbelievable? It's a thing that has actually led to weakening students, making it harder for people to understand the breadth and depth ideologically of this country, and is ripping our country apart. A lot of people in higher ed, they don't recognize it and they don't want to, but I know you do. So let's strike back against that by widening our circle of people that we know and love, and forcing the widening of circles of people under our, not just our control, but under our leadership. How? Well, there's a number of ways, a number of protocols for thinking about this. We need to encourage diversity in conversation in our institutions. How do you encourage it? Well, you can do it. If you're at a university and you find that it's going one particular way politically, you can invite in people who think the other thing onto campuses. But inviting in visitors really isn't the way to do it. If you want to embrace diversity, you got to hire for diversity. You got to bring people in because they think differently. Hard to do. You need to recruit students because they think differently. You got to bring in faculty because they think differently and reward them and even put them in positions of authority. That's a really tricky thing. I was talking about this in one of our partners is UC Berkeley at AEI. They want this. And I said, can you ever imagine having a dean who's a conservative? No, it's tough to imagine. And, why is that? Well, it wouldn't really represent the faculty very well. That's exactly what they said about women in 1950. They wouldn't hire a woman as a president or as a dean, most colleges wouldn't in 1950, because it didn't really represent the faculty. That's discrimination. It's also a bad practice if you want to expand the way that people think. We can be represented by anybody good and virtuous, anybody interesting. It doesn't matter if we agree. What else? We can discourage silos on our campuses, in our organizations. Discourage people from surrounding themselves by people that they know. Why? How? By setting up organizations and setting up structures among students and among faculty such that they are mixing with people with whom they disagree and wouldn't ordinarily know. There are all kinds of creative ways to do that. And they will follow that lead. In other words, to create a culture where we're always looking for people who are different than we are because it's fun and it's interesting. Leaving things up laissez-faire culturally on campuses is usually a pretty bad idea because after a few years, you'll get something that the market will bear. And we don't always like that, nor should we. And the last is to stamp out the contempt, to create a culture where contempt isn't cool. It's funny, one of the things that, at AEI, it's not all peaches and cream. It's not all great and not all perfect, right? But one of the things I love about the place is that people are really nice to each other, and people are really good to each other, and people help each other. Why? Because we have a culture. We have a culture of love at AEI. How is the culture of love works? Aristotle would say that the perfect friendship, true love, comes from a mutual recognition and embrace of something that's bigger than we are. The mission of actually fighting for the people at the margins of society, of believing in the radical equality of human dignity. That's what brings us together at AEI. Doesn't mean everything's perfect all the time. But to the extent that we can say we have a culture where contempt sets us back and it's unacceptable because our mission is too important, and you know who's the biggest and most important proponent of that mission? Students. So you're the agent in this thing, and we need you to participate in this thing in a good and constructive way. So what can we do to enhance this kind of culture, to encourage conversation, to reward diversity, to discourage silos, and to eradicate contempt? If we do that, we're not only going to be striking back against this problem, we're going to get happier people, we're going to be better leaders, and we're going to get a better country. Here's my last thought before I open it up to you. I want to leave you with just a visual on this. As leaders, when you talk, look, we can do what we can with our sort of orbit of control and leadership. But when you talk, you have disproportionate leverage on this issue. Each one of us is going to leave this conference, and we're going to go back to our day jobs, and we're going to have hundreds of people who are listening to us. And a lot of them are leaders. We're going to have hundreds of people listening to them. Use the leverage. How? Remember that you're a missionary for this good thing. Some of you have been missionaries. Some of you train missionaries. I have unmitigated respect for missionaries. It's the hardest job because there's so much rejection, but there's so much joy at the same time. So here's what I want to leave you with. If you believe that the culture of contempt is a major threat but a huge opportunity, if you think that we can and should bring the country together, if you think that your campus should be a microcosm of a better America along these lines, then leave with this idea. This is an idea that I had just a few months ago. My wife and I, we teach marriage preparation at a Catholic retreat center near our home. 25 to 30 couples that are engaged a month come through. It's a great opportunity. We love it. And I was leaving the this retreat center a few months ago, and I noticed a sign over the door. And most of you are Protestants, so you've seen this before, because I know this is actually something that started in Southern Baptist churches. I've never seen this in a Catholic environment before, but it really struck me. It was a sign over the door, not as you come in, but as you go out to the parking lot. You know what it said? You are now entering mission territory. That's what we need to remember. If this is good and healthy and good enough for America and good enough for your campus, then it's good enough to share. And mission work is not just about the gospel of Jesus Christ as articulated in literal terms. It's also demonstrated in non-literal terms. And this, in my view, is our opportunity to do that. So as you leave this conference today, tomorrow, when you leave this conference, I want you to remember the sign over the door that's not here, but it will be in your minds, which is that you're now entering mission territory. God bless you and thank you.